The day was raw and gray. Autumn tapped on the windows with a light, aimless drizzle, as if nature itself had lost its inspiration. Adelina stood by the window of the new kitchen, listening to the silence. The house, though spacious, with high ceilings and large windows, gave her a strange feeling, unwelcoming, as though it didn't belong to her. She knew that moving here with Durant was their first step toward an independent family life. But this house, it seemed as though it had long been someone else's. "How are you settling in?" came a voice from behind her. Adelina flinched. It was Deborah, her mother-in-law. The woman had barely left their side for the past few days, helping with the move and organizing the house. Her assistance was persistent, yet offered with such politeness that declining felt rude. "Yes, everything's fine," Adelina replied curtly, turning around. Deborah stood in the kitchen doorway with a soft but subtly probing smile. Her straight back and perfect posture revealed a woman accustomed to being in control. She surveyed the kitchen, as if ensuring everything was in its proper place. "Remember, Durant likes the table set by 6 in the evening," she remarked. "It's a habit of his since childhood, dinner first, then everything else. It gives him a sense of stability." Adelina said nothing. She knew her mother-in-law was a woman of another era, and expecting her to have a different outlook would be strange. Yet every such comment chipped away at her confidence. She felt constantly judged. Outside, the rain grew heavier, the howling wind cutting through the quiet. Adelina took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling of being an outsider here. She recalled the joy she felt when Durant had said this house would mark the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. Her heart had fluttered with happiness then. But now, that joy had given way to unease. Weeks had passed, but Adelina still couldn't rid herself of the sense that this house reflected not her tastes, but someone else's choices. Even the walls seemed to whisper that roles were in place here, roles she hadn't set. A strange, subtle uneasiness shadowed her, growing more tangible with each passing day. Deborah visited almost daily. Sometimes she came with advice, other times with dishes she claimed Durant simply adores. Adelina tried to remain polite and grateful, but these visits began to feel like inspections. "You know," Deborah once said, carefully arranging plates on the table, "Durant always liked having something meaty for dinner. It's something from his childhood. I always try to cook something special for him." Adelina suppressed her irritation. Durant enjoyed her cooking and always praised her meals, yet Deborah's words planted a seed of doubt. What if she wasn't meeting expectations? Deborah sat down at the table, sighing wearily, and looked at Adelina as though she were a student in need of guidance. "You're doing well, of course, trying your best. But you know, family isn't just about routine. It's about being needed. Durant is that kind of person. He's used to being cared for." The words pierced her like fine needles. Adelina felt something tighten inside her. She wanted to argue but simply nodded instead. That evening, when Durant returned from work, Deborah was still at the house. She greeted her son with a smile and handed him a plate of his favorite pie. Durant hugged his mother and thanked her. Adelina stood to the side, feeling her role in this home grow more tenuous. After dinner, Deborah prepared to leave, but she lingered in the hallway. Turning to Adelina, she said, "You know, I think you'll manage. But don't be afraid to ask me for advice. I was a wife for so many years. Experience is a valuable thing." Adelina watched as Deborah slowly put on her coat and left, leaving behind a trace of perfume and a vague sense of unease. She knew these weren't just words. They carried something more, something hidden behind their polite veneer. And that something began weaving an invisible web around her. On one particularly foggy day, when the soft glow of streetlights barely pierced through the thick autumn air, Adelina felt especially downcast. Durant was working late again, and the house was filled with a silence that had become all too familiar. She wandered from room to room, mechanically moving things around, trying to escape the feeling that the house still didn't belong to her. Her gaze fell on an old wardrobe at the end of the hallway, one she had been meaning to sort out for some time. Deciding that tidying up might distract her from her anxious thoughts, Adelina approached it and opened the heavy doors, the creak breaking the silence unpleasantly. Inside, on the bottom shelf, she noticed a dusty box. Her intuition told her it might hold something interesting. Opening the lid, Adelina found old photographs and letters. Most of the pictures were black and white, featuring people she didn't recognize. But one photograph caught her attention. It was of Deborah, young, smiling softly at the camera. Next to her stood a man whose face was both familiar and unfamiliar. They held hands, their poses revealing an intimate closeness. On the back of the photograph was an inscription, "My happiness." 1992, Adelina frowned. In these pictures, Deborah looked different, not the stern, self-assured woman Adelina knew, but someone brimming with genuine joy. She continued rummaging through the box and found several letters. The handwriting was neat and precise, but the contents left Adelina unsettled. "My dear, I can no longer hide my feelings. What we did has changed me forever. You become a part of my life, but also the reason I've lost so much. Sometimes I think I could have been happy if things had turned out differently." These words stirred both curiosity and unease within Adelina. She felt she had stumbled upon something significant, something that could explain many of Deborah's peculiar behaviors. Perhaps this past was the reason behind her obsessive need to control Durant's life, to keep her son close. Adelina realized that Deborah was far more complicated than she initially appeared. The evening dragged on endlessly. Durant came home later than usual, and Adelina, unable to suppress her anxiety any longer, showed him the photographs. "Did you know about this?" she asked, holding up the picture of his mother holding hands with an unfamiliar man. Durant stared at the image for a long time, his expression unreadable. "I've never seen this before," he said with a shrug. "It's probably someone from her past. I don't think it matters." Adelina felt irritation bubbling up inside her. Her intuition told her this was more than just a random detail. But she decided to let the matter rest. Durant clearly didn't see anything important in it. A few days later, Leonardo, an old family friend, came to visit. Always charming and affable, his confidence stood out even among Durant's usual company. Leonardo was relaxed and engaging around Adelina, his compliments and attention unintentionally drawing her in. Yet something about his manner made her uneasy. "You're doing a great job managing the house, Adelina," he said over lunch, his tone friendly, though there was a spark in his eyes that unsettled her. "Not everyone can keep things in such good order." Deborah watched the exchange intently, her face revealing nothing. After Leonardo left, she remarked abruptly, "Leonardo's a good man, always has been a friend to us. Durant trusts him, but be careful. Don't let him cross any lines." These words left Adelina puzzled. What was she trying to say? Was it advice, a warning, or a veiled threat? Her heart clenched with conflicting thoughts. A few days later, Leonardo visited again. Adelina didn't know how to react. His conversations grew increasingly personal, and his presence became more intrusive. She felt a strange tension between them but couldn't tell whether it stemmed from his intentions or her own doubts. Durant seemed oblivious to anything unusual, but Deborah, on the other hand, grew more reserved. One day, she approached Adelina as she was preparing dinner and said quietly, "You know, Adelina, the most important thing in a family is loyalty. Even the smallest doubts can destroy everything." The words felt like an accusation. Adelina felt a wave of anger and shame wash over her. She hadn't done anything wrong, yet her mother-in-law already seemed to judge her. That night, Adelina couldn't sleep. Her thoughts raced from Leonardo to Deborah, from the old photographs to her own fears. For the first time, she felt that the house, which was supposed to be her refuge, had turned into a cage where every aspect of her life was under Deborah's scrutinizing gaze. In the quiet half-darkness of the bedroom, she looked at Durant, peacefully sleeping beside her. Her heart tightened at the thought that she might lose control over her life if she didn't take action. But how could she stand up to a woman so skilled at manipulating others? Adelina realized this battle was only beginning. The morning light was cold, flooding the room with shades of gray. Adelina woke earlier than Durant, feeling a strange tightness in her chest, as if the night had left invisible imprints of anxiety on her heart. Leonardo lingered in her thoughts, not because she had any feelings for him, but because his sudden attention and ambiguous remarks couldn't help but worry her. Adelina understood that now, not only Deborah but Leonardo himself had become a piece in this strange chess game, where every move was being made outside her control. That evening, as Adelina finished cleaning the kitchen, Deborah appeared once again at the threshold. Her presence no longer embarrassed Adelina as it once had, it now evoked irritation mixed with subtle fear. Her mother-in-law stepped inside without removing her coat, surveying the house with a quick glance before giving a slight nod, as if approving the order. "You're doing well, Adelina," she began, "but remember, a house isn't just walls, it's the atmosphere. You create it for Durant. He's used to warmth, to feeling safe at home. And trust me, that's not as easy as it seems." Every word sounded like a reproach, thinly veiled as concern. Adelina felt something inside her stretch taut, like a string ready to snap. She looked at Deborah with restrained but firm resolve. "I think Durant and I will create the atmosphere we need ourselves." Deborah lingered on Adelina's face, her eyes glinting with something hard to decipher, a mix of surprise and faint disdain. Instead of responding, she simply smirked, shifted the subject, and began discussing her plans for the upcoming weekend as if nothing had happened. When Deborah finally left, Adelina felt the air in the house grow lighter. She sank onto the couch, running her hand over her face. Her mother-in-law's words, her tone, her demeanor, all of it seemed part of an intricately crafted strategy, as though Deborah wasn't just present in their lives but weaving a web that slowly, inexorably, ensnared her. The next day, Leonardo visited again. Durant was home, which gave Adelina some comfort, at least until Deborah arrived shortly after. Her visits were becoming increasingly frequent, and her gaze lingered on Adelina's face more often, carrying an air of hidden intent. During dinner, as they sat at the table, Leonardo poured wine and launched into another story from his work, a tale that seemed to entertain everyone except Adelina. She felt Deborah's eyes on her, their weight almost tangible, like a touch. "You're so quiet today, Adelina," Leonardo suddenly remarked, his tone disarmingly gentle. "I think you should relax. Maybe you just need a distraction, even for a little while." Adelina felt her cheeks flush. She glanced quickly at Durant, but he only smiled, noticing nothing unusual in his friend's words. Deborah, however, raised her eyebrows slightly, her gaze growing cautious. After dinner, when Durant went out to take the trash, leaving Leonardo and Deborah in the living room, Adelina retreated to the kitchen to be alone. She stood by the window, trying to steady her thoughts, when she heard the door behind her open. Turning around, she saw Leonardo. "You seem tense, Adelina," he said with a soft smile. "Is it Deborah? Or something else?" His words felt too personal to be casual. Adelina didn't know how to respond, so she turned back to the sink, pretending to be busy washing dishes. "You know," Leonardo continued, stepping closer, "it seems to me that you're losing a bit of yourself here. This house, this environment. You're a very different person, aren't you?" Adelina spun around abruptly. "Leonardo, what are you trying to say?" Her voice was cold, though inside, her anxiety was mounting. Leonardo squinted slightly, his smile turning almost insolent. I'm just saying that sometimes people need more than they think. Just think about it. At that moment, Durant walked into the room. His gaze shifted from Leonardo to Adelina, his expression darkening. What's going on here? He asked, his voice tense. Nothing, Adelina replied quickly. We were just talking about work. Leonardo smirked and shrugged. Yes, nothing special, Durant. Just a conversation. Durant didn't respond, but the tension in the room was palpable. After Leonardo and Deborah left, Adelina felt completely drained. She knew this was only the beginning of something larger, something that could tear their family apart. That night, she lay awake for hours, listening to Durant's steady breathing beside her. Her thoughts kept circling back to Deborah's words, Leonardo's glances, and the nagging sense that she was being drawn into a game with rules she didn't fully understand. She knew Deborah wouldn't miss the opportunity to exploit this situation to prove her point. But within Adelina, a firm resolve was beginning to grow. She would no longer allow herself to be controlled. She realized she needed to act, or else she would be pulled even deeper into the web of manipulation. The autumn morning brought a crisp wind that swirled through the streets, rattling the windows and carrying away the last leaves. Adelina sat at the kitchen table, clutching a hot cup of tea, but her thoughts were far from the comforting warmth. The events of the previous day were stuck in her mind like a splinter. Leonardo's words, his look, and then the tension with which Durant had entered the room, all of it added another link to the chain of worries that bound her life in this house. As usual, Durant left for work, leaving her alone. But solitude brought no peace. Adelina couldn't shake the feeling that everything around her was pulsing with tension. She began cleaning the kitchen, hoping to distract herself, but her hands trembled, and her thoughts stubbornly returned to what had happened. Seeking answers, she went back up to the attic. The box of photographs and letters was still there. Adelina opened it, scrutinizing the old pictures that seemed like silent witnesses to someone else's life. Among them, she found another photo she had missed before. Deborah and the same man stood in front of a large house. Adelina noticed with a start that the house resembled their own. Her heart raced. Doubts flooded her mind. This man, this house. It all seemed tied to a hidden past that was now quietly seeping into her life. Adelina's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door. Someone had entered the house. She quickly put the box back and went downstairs. In the doorway stood Deborah, her gaze as cold and assessing as ever. "You're alone today?" Deborah asked, glancing around the house. Durant mentioned he had a lot of work. Adelina nodded, trying to hide her unease. She felt as though Deborah somehow knew what she had been doing in the attic. "You look tired," Deborah continued, stepping into the living room. "Perhaps you should rest. You've been doing so much." Adelina said nothing. The tension inside her was building, but she didn't want to give Deborah any reason to suspect that something was amiss. Deborah looked around as if searching for something that had slipped out of her control. Then she suddenly turned to Adelina. "Do you understand, Adelina?" she began, her voice quiet but firm, "that trust is the most important thing in a family? Without it, everything falls apart. And trust, you see, must be earned." Her words felt like a veiled threat. Adelina could feel her anger rising. But instead of responding, she nodded, letting Deborah believe her words had hit their mark. That evening, when Durant returned from work, Adelina sensed that something was about to happen. The tension that had been building inside her demanded release, but she wasn't sure where to begin. They ate dinner in silence until Durant broke it. "Leonardo called today," he said, pushing his plate aside. "He said he'd like to come by tomorrow. He has some business to discuss." Adelina felt her shoulders tighten. Her inner voice screamed that she needed to act, but what could she do? "Durant," she began, mustering her courage, "I need to talk to you." He looked at her, his face showing exhaustion but his eyes attentive. "I want you to understand, it's not easy for me here. I'm trying, but it feels like I'm losing control of my own life. Your mother, she—" Durant cut her off, his voice sharp. "My mother just wants to help. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be, Adelina. You have to understand that she will always be a part of our lives." His words hurt her more deeply than she had expected. She felt tears welling up but held them back. "It's not just help, Durant. It's control. She does everything she can to make me feel like an outsider in this house. And Leonardo." "What about Leonardo?" he interrupted, his tone turning even sharper. Adelina looked him directly in the eyes. She could no longer keep silent. "He oversteps. His looks, his words. Don't you see it?" Durant froze, his face tense. "Leonardo is my friend, Adelina. You're imagining things that aren't there." Those words were the final straw. Adelina stood up from the table and left the room, leaving Durant behind. She felt as though her world was crumbling, and she was powerless to stop it. Later that night, as darkness enveloped the house, Adelina sat by the bedroom window, staring out at the empty street. Deborah's words echoed in her mind, Leonardo's glances haunted her, and Durant's cold response cut her deeply. She knew things would only get harder from here. Deborah would continue her pressure, Leonardo wasn't going to disappear from their lives, and Durant seemed unwilling to see what was so obvious to her. But something new was stirring within Adelina, a sense of determination. She realized that if she didn't take control of the situation, she would lose everything. That night, she made a vow to herself: no more compromises, no more trying to please. She would do whatever it took to protect her life and her emotions, even if it meant going against everyone. The next morning, Adelina woke with the same sense of unease that had plagued her for days. Rain pattered against the windows in fine droplets, as if nature mirrored her inner turmoil. She knew Leonardo would be coming to the house today, and his visit would likely spark yet another round of tension. Durant had left early, leaving behind only the scent of coffee and the faint chill of unresolved words from their conversation the night before. Adelina stared into the empty kitchen, trying to gather her thoughts, but instead felt her fears and doubts rising, flooding her mind. An hour later, the doorbell rang. Adelina already knew who it was before she opened the door. Leonardo stood there, smiling his signature smile that now seemed less friendly and more calculated, almost unsettling. He was wearing a coat, raindrops glistening on his shoulders, but as he stepped inside, he brushed them off as if bringing in something far colder than water. "Did Durant say I'd be expected?" he asked with casual nonchalance, walking into the living room without waiting for her reply. Adelina tensed instinctively. She wanted to tell him that Durant would be late, but instead, she simply nodded and sat across from him. The conversation started as usual. Leonardo talked about his work and recent successes. But at some point, his tone shifted. "You've changed, Adelina," he suddenly remarked, studying her face intently. "You used to seem lighter. Now, it's as if something is weighing you down." His words were like a finely sharpened blade, grazing her composure. Adelina felt her heart race but tried to maintain a calm expression. "I'm fine, Leonardo. Everyone has difficult days." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to an almost intimate tone. "Are you sure? Sometimes it feels like you're a bird in a cage here. Maybe I'm wrong, but you deserve more." These words were the last straw. Adelina rose abruptly from the couch, her voice trembling with restrained anger. "Leonardo, did you come here on business, or are you just playing the savior? Because if it's the latter, you've got the wrong door." His expression shifted, the faint smile disappeared, and his eyes gleamed with a predatory spark. He stood up, clearly not expecting such a response, but before he could say anything more, the doorbell rang. Adelina, relieved, rushed to the door. Deborah stood on the threshold. As she entered, Deborah immediately noticed Leonardo. Her expression was as calm as ever, but Adelina detected a subtle tension in her movements, which she seemed to be trying to conceal. "Ah, Leonardo, you're already here," she said, removing her gloves. "I hope you're not distracting Adelina too much." Leonardo smirked and shrugged. "We were just chatting. Though I must admit, I feel like I've interrupted something." Deborah sat down on the couch, clearly intending to stay for a while. Her presence made the atmosphere even more strained. Adelina felt her nerves stretched like taut strings, ready to snap. "Adelina, dear," Deborah began with a faint smile, "I've been meaning to talk to you. You know, I've always believed that a woman's home should have harmony. And for that to happen, it's important to keep everything under control. That's part of our responsibilities, isn't it?" Her words sounded like a reproach. Adelina couldn't hold back. She raised her eyes to Deborah, her voice firm. "Do you think I'm not managing? Or is this just another way of making sure I live the way you think I should?" The room fell silent. Leonardo stood, clearly unwilling to witness the conversation any further. "I should get going. Durant will probably be home soon. I'll drop by another time." As the door closed behind him, Deborah turned her gaze back to Adelina. Her face had grown cold, the mask of friendliness gone. "You're too sharp, Adelina. It doesn't suit you. A woman should be soft, capable of smoothing over rough edges." Adelina could no longer tolerate it. She stood, her voice ringing with emotion. "Maybe you should stop trying to teach me how to be a woman the way you think is right. I'm living my life, not yours." Deborah froze. Her eyes narrowed, but something flickered in them, something that resembled respect. She stood and made her way to the door, but before leaving, she paused and said, "You're stronger than I thought. But remember, strength isn't always what holds a family together. Sometimes, it's what tears it apart." Adelina stood alone in the empty room. Her breathing was uneven, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of freedom. She knew this was only the first battle, but now she was ready for whatever lay ahead.